Thank you for joining us this afternoon on this very important day where we honor our fallen officers of the Salt Lake City Police Department. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize some dignitaries and special guests that are here today. First and foremost, Mayor Biskupski. Thank you so much for being here. Mayor, this is 4 for 4. You've been here 4 years in a row, and I just want to point that out and say thank you for your support over those 4 years, and especially on this day. We have sitting next to her, Patrick Cleary, her Chief of Staff. In the back is Dr. Jennifer Seelig, Senior Advisor. We have, from the Police Foundation, Cindy Kendred. I see you back there, Cindy. Thank you for being with us today. And most importantly, thank you to the family members and the friends and our officers of the Salt Lake City Police Department. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We'll first have an invocation from Chaplain Larry Love, then a presentation of the colors by the Motors and the Explorers Honor Guard, followed by the national anthem performed by Officer Miles Knapp. Thank you.
Please join with me in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we are so thankful that we're able to meet today to give respect and honor to the fallen officers. Bless us with thy Spirit. Bless those that will participate in this program, that they will be able to be inspired both in word and in music. Bless our current officers, that they will have protection and that they will also have thy Spirit to be with them. Bless us today that we can honor the officers and their families. Bless the families with hope and peace in their hearts. And we say these things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Detail, Roland colors. Detail, post colors.
We will now perform the roll call for our fallen officers. An officer of corresponding rank will now read each name. As each name is read, a carnation will be placed in a vase by a remembrance by either a family member or an explorer. Officer William Cook will be read by Officer John Lundgren.
Officer William Cook, October 18th, 1858. Officer Cook was the first Salt Lake City police officer to be murdered in the line of duty. On the afternoon of October 13th, Cook was on duty and alone at the city jail. 3 men came to the jail at 100 South State Street and demanded the release of an inmate. When he refused, one of the men shot him in the thigh. Cook died 5 days later, October 18th, 1858. Although the killer fled the city, he was shot and killed October 21st, 1858, near Fort Bridger, Wyoming, by a Salt Lake mail carrier familiar with the murder. Cook, 55, was married and the father of 6 children. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery.
Chief Andrew H. Berg will be read by retired Captain Judy Danker.
Chief Andrew Burt was murdered by a deranged man in downtown Salt Lake City, August 25th, 1883. Accompanied by the city watermaster, Burt was searching for a suspect who had earlier threatened the life of a local merchant. When they found the suspect at 200 South Main, he shot Chief Burt with a 1470 caliber rifle. The watermaster was also wounded but managed to disarm the suspect, who was immediately captured. Burt, 54, was married and the father of a large number of children. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery.
Sgt Alonzo M Wilson will be read by Sgt Joe Sear.
Sgt Alonzo M Wilson, April 12, 1894. Sergeant Wilson died from an accidental gunshot wound while working as the morning desk sergeant in the Salt Lake City Police Station located at 100 South State Street. A patrolman dropped a loaded pistol that discharged as it hit the floor. The bullet struck Wilson in the right knee, shattering his femur. He was taken to a hospital where the leg was amputated. During surgery, doctors discovered the bullet had ranged up into his torso. Wilson died approximately 5 hours after being shot April 12, 1894. Wilson, 54, was married and the father of 6 children. His wife gave birth to their 7th child the day after his death. He is buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery, Salt Lake City, Utah.
Officer Charles S. Ford will be read by Darren Sipes. Oh, I'm sorry. Officer Jeff Smith?
Yep.
Thank you.
Officer Charles S. Ford, December 14th, 1907. Officer Ford was shot and killed following the armed robbery of a Salt Lake City bar, December 14th, 1907. At approximately 2:30 a.m., Ford was working his 3rd shift after returning to law enforcement from a 16-year absence. He was standing on the northeast corner of 600 South and 200 West when 2 armed robbers, fleeing the scene of a robbery in the Albany Hotel bar across the street, shot him in the chest. He died 12 hours later at St. Mark's Hospital. The 2 robbers managed to flee Utah. 3 suspects were apprehended and charged with Ford's murder. 1 had been released from prison 1 week prior to the robbery. 1 was arrested in Portland a month later. A second was shot to death by Seattle officers in May 1908. The first robber was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. For health reasons, his sentence was terminated in 1918. He died several months later. Ford, 51, was married and the father of 2 grown daughters. He is buried in the Mount Olivet Cemetery, Salt Lake City.
Officer Charles C. Reilly will be read by Miles Knapp.
Officer Charles C. Reilly, October 5, 1909. Officer Reilly was shot and killed October 5, 1909, while escorting a suspect to jail in Salt Lake City. A reserve officer, Reilly had located 2 suspects wanted in connection with an armed robbery that occurred just minutes before. Officer Reilly and his prisoners were walking northbound on State Street at approximately 180 South when one of the men produced a pistol and shot the officer twice. The crime occurred in full view of a large crowd of patrons at the Orpheum Theater. The men fled, but the shooter was later captured and convicted of first-degree murder. He was paroled in 1920. Reilly, 34, was married and the father of a young daughter. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery.
Sergeant John H. Johnston will be read by Sergeant Brandon Shear.
Sergeant John H. Johnston, July 8, 1911. Sergeant Johnston died July 8, 1911 of a gunshot wound suffered in an incident that occurred 3 days earlier. In the early morning hours of July 5th, Johnston and 2 other officers responded to a domestic disturbance in a room at the Albert Hotel at 119 South West Temple. Officers discovered an intoxicated man threatening his wife with a .32 caliber revolver. When Sergeant Johnston stepped between the couple, the husband shot him once in the abdomen. He was transported to St. Mark's Hospital where he died. The suspect was charged with first-degree murder, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. 2 years later, after the Supreme Court ordered a new trial, the suspect pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was paroled in 1917. Johnston, 42, was married and the father of 2 children. He was buried in Mount Calvary Cemetery, Salt Lake City.
Officer Anthony Griffiths will be read this afternoon by his great-great-grandson, Andrew Griffiths? Anthony Griffiths, sorry, Anthony.
Officer Thomas F. Griffiths, June 25th, 1913. Officer Griffiths responded to a call near 250 West, 200 South, where he arrested a suspect for assault. While headed to a nearby call box, the suspect broke away and fled. Griffiths pursued the suspect behind a business where he was shot 3 times on June 25th, 1913. The suspect was arrested and imprisoned, but he escaped in 1919, never to be recaptured. Griffiths, 39, was married and the father of 6 children. He was buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery.
Detective Green B. Hamby will be honored by Detective Corey Checketts.
Detective Green B. Hamby, February 8, 1921. Detective Hamby died after being shot by a burglary suspect February 8, 1921. Acting on a tip, Hamby and other officers went to the Nord Hotel at 59.5 East, 200 South. While attempting to gain access to a room where the men had been staying, Detective Hamby was shot in the head by a 4th suspect hiding inside. The suspect was killed by return fire from the other officers. Hamby, 49, was married and had 3 children. Detective Hamby is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery.
Sergeant Nephi Pierce will be read by Sergeant Lisa Piscadlo.
Sergeant Nephi Pierce, March 26, 1923. Sergeant Pierce died March 26, 1923 from the effects of a gunshot wound inflicted 4 months earlier by an armed robbery suspect. Shortly after midnight, November 28, 1922, Sergeant Pierce and Officer George Watson were on foot patrol near 525 South Main Street. As they attempted to question two men matching the descriptions of a pair of robbery suspects, one of the suspects drew a gun. Sergeant Pierce sought cover behind a tree, where a suspect shot him once in the back. Officer Watson was then pistol whipped and left for dead. The two suspects were captured the following morning. Officer Watson recovered, but Sergeant Pierce's spine was severed. The assailants were convicted of assault and sent to prison. Sergeant Pierce died 4 months later. The shooter was convicted of murder and executed by firing squad on February 20th, 1925. The second suspect was paroled in 1926. Pierce, 54, was married and had no children. He is buried in the Mount Olivet Cemetery, Salt Lake City.
Officer David H. Crowther will be read by Officer John Beck.
Officer Crowther was shot to death by a transient October 12, 1923. A search was launched when he failed to return home from patrol the previous night. At 10 a.m., the body of the 45-year-old officer was found on the bank of the Jordan River, 3 blocks from his home. On October 16, 1923, 3 men driving Officer Crowther's blood-stained vehicle were arrested in Ludlow, California. The men were extradited to Utah, charged and tried, and found guilty of robbery and murder. 2 of the men were eventually paroled. The suspect who shot Officer Crowther was executed at the Utah State Prison in 1926. Crowther, 45, was married and the father of 3 children. He is buried in the Salt Lake Cemetery.
Officers Brigham H. Honey Jr. and William N. Huntsman will be read by Douglas Dunbar.
February 16, 1924. Officer Honey and Huntsman were gunned down by robbery suspects. At 11:30 p.m. Saturday, February 16, 1924, Officers William N. Huntsman and Brigham H. Honey Jr. heard a shot fired outside the State Cafe, 46 West Broadway, which was being robbed. Both officers pursued the suspect to 337 South Main, and a gun battle ensued. Huntsman was killed immediately, while Honey died several hours later. Huntsman, 26, and Honey, 34, are buried near each other in the Salt Lake City Cemetery.
Officer Gustav J. Gus Lund will be read by Officer Matthew Tail.
Officer Gustav J. Gus Lund, August 25th, 1924. Officer Lund died after being struck by a truck in the intersection of 1100 East, 2100 South, August 25th, 1924. Lund was directing noontime traffic when he stepped between the truck and a trailer it was towing. He died instantly. Lund, 61, was married and the father of 10 children. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery.
Special Officer Roland R. Tanner will be read by Officer Cooper Landvetter.
Special Officer Roland R. Tanner, September 10, 1927. Roland R. Tanner was appointed as a special officer upon taking employment with the police department. He was assigned to Liberty Park as his area of responsibility. During the 3 years prior to his death, he had become familiar with all the animals in the Liberty Park Zoo, and as a matter of habit, he would reach in and pat the lions on the head as he passed by. On September 3rd, 1927, Charles Lindbergh was being celebrated in Salt Lake City with a large parade and festivities, with the parade ending in Liberty Park, where there was a large party being held that included bands and fireworks. As Officer Tanner was making his rounds through the zoo area, and as he reached in to pet the lions, they attacked, grabbing his hand and arm in the mouth of one of the lions and proceeded to cause significant injury. A passerby assisted the officer by getting a bar and breaking the lion's hold on Tanner's extremity, thus allowing him to be taken to the hospital, where he was treated for the bites and injuries. The prognosis for Officer Tanner's recovery was good, but due to an infection which set in, he died at home of the injuries on September 10th, 1927. Tanner, 66, was married and the father of 4 children. He is buried in the Beaver City Cemetery in Beaver, Utah.
Officer Carl J. Carlson will be read by Officer Andrew Peterson.
March 9th, 1929. Officer Carlson was killed by injuries sustained in a liquor bust. Carlson and fellow officers raided a building at 23 South West Temple, where they located several barrels of mash. One of the 50-gallon barrels fell on Officer Carlson's foot, causing him to jump back and strike his head against the wall. Following treatment for the foot injury at the hospital, Officer Carlson attended a wrestling exhibition. There he was found semi-conscious, clinging to a lamppost. Taken to the hospital, he died the following morning, March 9th, 1929, of a basal skull fracture received while striking his head during the liquor raid. Carlson, 39, was married and the father of 6 children. He is buried at the Wasatch Lawn Memorial Park, Salt Lake County.
Officer Blaine L. Baxter will be read by Officer Eric Philbrick.
Officer Blaine L. Baxter, September 4th, 1935. Officer Baxter was killed September 4th, 1935 in a motorcycle accident while enforcing speed limits in Salt Lake City. Baxter was conducting routine speed enforcement on 200 West between 200 and 300 North when he observed a vehicle traveling south at a high rate of speed and initiated a pursuit. At the intersection of 100 North and 200 West, a vehicle turned in front of the officer. Baxter lost control of his motorcycle while taking evasive action and crashed into the wall of the building. He suffered a broken neck and died at the local hospital. Baxter, 28, was married and the father of 2 children. He is buried in Salt Lake City Cemetery.
Sergeant Thomas W. Stroud will be read by Sergeant Sam Wolf.
Sergeant Thomas W. Stroud, January 5th, 1951. Sergeant Stroud was accidentally killed at the Salt Lake City Police Station, January 5th, 1951. At 6:30 p.m., Stroud and another officer were preparing for the department-sponsored children's party. As the 2 officers were loading a vehicle, which was located at 100 South State Street, Sergeant Stroud's pistol fell from his waistband and struck the sidewalk. The weapon discharged, and the officer was struck through the heart, killing him instantly. Stroud, 34, was married and the father of 2 sons. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery.
Detective Sergeant Owen T Farley will be read by Detective Jeff Mott.
Sergeant Farley was shot and killed by a robbery suspect May 23, 1951, after arresting a man and woman in possession of a car that investigators believed was used in the robbery in Ogden. Farley arrested the male suspect without incident, who was searched and handcuffed behind his back. The female suspect was also arrested but not handcuffed. Farley decided to use the suspect vehicle to transport arrestees to the station as the police vehicle had vapor locked and was inoperable. The male arrestee was seated in the center front seat, the female on the right front seat, with Farley at the wheel. As Farley made a U-turn, the male produced a handgun and fatally shot Sergeant Farley in the stomach. Farley died a short time later at a local hospital. Farley, 37, was married and the father of 3 children. He is buried in the Heber City Cemetery, Heber, Utah.
Officer Harold A. Peterson Sr. will be read by Officer Brian S. Truth.
Officer Harold A. Peterson Sr., October 27, 1954, was killed in a traffic accident October 27, 1954 at approximately 10 a.m. Peterson was patrolling on his 3-wheeled motorcycle. As he entered the intersection of 1300 South and 1300 East, a vehicle driven by an elderly man turned in front of him. The collision knocked Officer Peterson from his motorcycle, dragged him more than 30 feet, and pinned him beneath the vehicle. He died of severe head trauma. Peterson, 54, was married and a father of a son who would go on to become a Salt Lake City police officer. Peterson is buried at the Wasatch Lawn Memorial Park, Salt Lake County.
Detective Percy L. Perk Clark will be read by Detective Jennifer Overman.
Detective Percy L. Perk Clark, January 11, 1973. Detective Clark was shot and killed during an armed robbery January 11th of 1973 during a stakeout at 564 3rd Avenue. 2 suspects arrived to rob a pharmacy. As they exited, the detective called for their surrender. 1 suspect opened fire, striking Clark in the head. Officers returned fire, killing the shooter. The 2nd suspect surrendered. Clark, 42, is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery.
Detective David W. Olsen will be read by Officer Drew Hadley.
Detective David W. Olsen, March 22, 1980. Detective Olsen joined the police department in October 1971. A combat veteran of the Vietnam War, Olsen served the department in patrol, K-9, and special investigations. He was known to his close friends as Hagger. In the early morning hours of April 3, 1977, Olsen, while in the performance of his duties, was accidentally wounded. As a result, he was unable to return to active duty and died March 22, 1980.
Sgt Ronald L Heaps will be read by Sergeant Brandon Shear.
Sergeant Ronald L Heaps, January 13, 1982. Sergeant Heaps was shot and killed while investigating a suspicious person call January 13, 1982. At approximately 9:25 p.m., Heaps and 2 other officers responded to the area of 1300 South, 300 East. They contacted the occupants of a motorhome, unaware that one of them was wanted for the October 2, 1981 murder of California Highway Patrol Officer John Martinez. When the officers inquired about the ownership of the motorhome, the wanted suspect produced a 9mm pistol and began firing. Sergeant Heaps was struck between the panels of his body armor and died within a few minutes. Although wounded, the 2nd officer shot and killed the assailant. Another suspect attempting to flee the area was shot and killed by the 3rd officer. Heaps, 32, was married and the father of 4 children. Posthumously promoted to sergeant, he is buried in the Alpine City Cemetery.
Officer Michael J. Denman will be read by Officer James Bishop.
Officer Denman was struck and killed by a motorist July 17, 2000. Denman was on an afternoon bike patrol at 1500 South State when a vehicle jumped the curb and struck him from behind. The officer suffered massive head injuries and died shortly after arriving to the hospital. Following an investigation, the suspect was charged with negligent homicide. An earlier drug charge was also reactivated. Regardless, he secured bail and subsequently fled the country. Denman, 30, was married and the father of 3 children. He's buried in the Bountiful City Cemetery.
Sergeant James E Oni will be read by Sergeant Alan Christensen.
Sergeant James E Oni, September 18, 2001. Sergeant Oni was killed in a traffic crash on Interstate 80, September 18, 2001. Shortly after 2:30 p.m., Oni encountered a disabled vehicle in the middle of the eastbound lanes at approximately 3800 West. He parked his unmarked police unit vehicle behind the disabled vehicle and activated his red and blue strobe lights. While seated behind the wheel, Oni's car was struck from behind by a pickup traveling at a high rate of speed. Although wearing a seatbelt, the officer died almost instantly from the massive chest trauma caused by the steering column. Oni, 48, is survived by his wife and 2 children. He is buried at Wasatch Lawn Memorial Park, Salt Lake County.
Detective James W. Colley will be read by Lieutenant Derek Diamond.
Detective Colley was killed in Iraq on Saturday, March 29, 2003, defending the freedom he so cherished. He was serving as Marine Reservist and Staff Sergeant of 1st Platoon, Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marine Regiment. After 12 years of active duty with the Marines, Colley joined the Salt Lake City Police Department on April 10, 1997. He served honorably as an officer, a detective in the Gang Suppression Unit, and a member of the SWAT team. Whether serving as a police officer on the home front or a Marine in a faraway land, Detective Colley was willing to sacrifice his life in the name of peace, safety, and justice. His life revolved around serving others, and that service can best be summed up by the words inscribed on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial. It is not how these officers died that made them heroes, it is how they lived. Colley, 41, is survived by his wife and 2 children. He is buried in the Roy City Cemetery.
21 gun salute was performed by the Salt Lake City SWAT team. Taps performed by the Salt Lake City Police Explorers. The bagpipe was Michael Gibbs of the Heathen Highlanders. Thank you very, very much. I'd like to now introduce Mayor Biskupski, who will give us some remarks. Thank you, Mayor.
Good afternoon. It is a great honor for me to be with you today to express my deepest gratitude and respect for our fallen officers. Each year, this solemn occasion gives us the opportunity to reflect on the courage and dedication that runs through every member of this excellent police department and their families. Each one of these we honor today gave their lives in service and protection of the people of this city and this country. The great sacrifice of this profession is that officers never know at the start of each shift whether they will return home again. Yet you answer the call every day. The officers we honor today gave their lives while protecting, serving, and supporting our community. There is no higher calling, and there is no greater sacrifice. To our police officers with us today, thank you for your enormous responsibility that you shoulder on our behalf. I extend my heartfelt condolences for the loss of your fellow officers. No matter how distant the loss, the love and respect you hold for your fallen comrades is immense, and they will survive in your memories and in the proud history of this department. Finally, I would like to take a moment to recognize the surviving family members of our fallen officers. I am truly sorry for your loss. Thank you for sharing your brave loved ones with us and for supporting them so completely in their work. This grateful city operates safely every day, in large part because your loved ones were committed to our success. The memory of our fallen officers is eternal. Decades will pass, centuries will evolve, yet rest assured, we will never forget. Thank you, and have a good day.
Mayor Biskupski, thank you for your very kind words of support. We appreciate it. And now, we're going to introduce Kathy Kester, who is a relative of Percy Clark, one of our fallen. This is a tradition that we started last year, so this is our second year. But so often, we focus on how and the great service and how these officers died in the line of duty. Kathy, you're going to share with us maybe a memory that we haven't heard. So please, Kathy.
He carried badge number 132 and his weapon of choice a single-action Colt revolver. Those closest to him called him Dirty Harry. My dad had bright blue eyes, and his name was Percy Lindsay Clark, but everybody called him Perk. He was a second-generation officer. He followed his father, Harold W. Clark, who served 41 years on the police department. Dad served just 21. My brother Kelly served 10 years in the Billings, Montana area. My son Lynn followed his grandfather, my father, into serving in the St. George area. When we were younger, we lived at the old police range behind the Capitol. My dad loved it, and so did my brothers. My dad won many pistol shooting events, and he was the happiest when he was hunting with his sons, son-in-laws, and many friends. He did reloading for the police department, and his friends. He would try new loads, and some were very hot. He knew everything about guns and reloading. While at the police station, or the police range, they had trustees at the range to take care of things. And if you couldn't find them or my dad, they'd be in the clubhouse jamming out on their guitars. Many became friends to him while they were there. He had an old red Willie Jeep that he just loved, that had a winch on the front of it, and if he couldn't get out of a tough spot, he used the winch to get him out. When he got home from a long day, he loved us girls to massage his head and his hair. Most of the time, he would just fall asleep. I would give anything to be able to do that again. His plaque hangs at 564 East 3rd Avenue, where he was murdered. My dad was one hell of a guy. Thank you.
Kathy, thank you so much. He was one hell of a guy. No doubt about it. I am so honored to be standing here before this big blue family, to see the women and men of the Salt Lake City Police Department that I serve. I am humbled to participate in this vigil in memoriam of the 25 Salt Lake City police officers who gave their lives in the line of duty. We embody the core values of the department. We serve with impeccable character. Some of the most compassionate acts I've ever seen have been done at the hands of the Salt Lake City police officers. We have a great commitment to the communities we serve. We communicate in openness and transparency, and we have an unwielding courage to serve and protect our community. When danger is at hand, when shots ring out, our officers run into danger when others flee. These values guide our actions and are built upon a strong heritage of our police department, a heritage that these 25 officers helped build. These officers served with integrity and character. Their lives are woven into the fabric of our department through blood, sweat, and tears. We honor them during this vigil today, as we do each year. And to the families and friends of these fallen officers, we commit to remember them, and we promise we will never forget them. I just want to leave you with this last thought. The word vigil is derived from the Latin word for wakefulness. It means literally a period of purposeful sleeplessness. That is, in sense, what we are here to do this afternoon. To refuse to sleep, to refuse to forget the heroes we have lost and the work that remains undone. Though we may grieve, we must emphatically reject despair. Unlike most other careers, the brave women and men who embark upon a life in law enforcement know fully that they may one day be called upon to lay down their life, just as these 25 officers have done before us. Those we honor this afternoon made that choice willingly, and that is why their ultimate sacrifice means so much. They served and sacrificed for a purpose far greater than themselves. I can think of no truer definition of a hero. To our fallen and families, we love you and we will never forget you. And thank you so much for being here this afternoon.